One of the interesting things, of course, which brings us on to our next topic about Trump and the USA, is that after losing the election, Trump, the end of 2020, over Christmas and New Year, Trump ordered the execution of a number of death row inmates. I think it was about 8 or 9 that were executed. And it seemed to be just because he could. Just because he had the power to do so, he wanted to do it before he left office. Yes, it maybe appeals a bit to his base, but I think it was just a power trip for him that he had the power to kill some people, so he thought he would. Pretty sickening and disgusting. Anyway,
and it's sad, isn't it, Tom?
Yeah.
It's sad that there are millions of people out there who find that appealing.
Yeah,
and a lot of them, and a lot of them say that they believe in God.
Well, there's an extraordinary thing, isn't it, that a lot of the Christian right in America are vehemently anti-abortion because they're pro-life, and yet they're totally pro the death penalty, pro capital punishment. So they're not really pro-life. I think they're more about controlling women and women's bodies. So that brings us on to the next topic, which is I wanted to sort of give an update, really, to a bit of, hopefully what's a bit of a fascinating update to some things in America about Trump and the Republican Party since Trump left office, since the inauguration of Biden. And partly because Trump is sort of off most social media, like, banned from Twitter and Facebook, and no longer president, we don't hear from him so much anymore, and stuff he says isn't shared so much anymore because it can't be. And so some of sort of what Trump is still doing and what the Republicans are doing is very rarely reported on in our British news. But I keep abreast of it reasonably well. So some of it is extraordinary and fascinating. So I just thought it would be time perhaps to share some of it with our viewers. So a little update on what's happening with Trump, the Republican Party, and sort of right-wing politics in America in the last sort of 5 or 6 months. So first thing, I've got a little list of 7 things, so I'll just buzz through them. So the first thing is that the American intelligence agencies, FBI, etc., have detailed once again how Russia did interfere in very detailed, complex ways, and the evidence has been much of the evidence has been provided of how Russia interfered in the 2016 election to help Trump get elected, and they did it again in 2020, but it wasn't successful. And that's not new. That's not new. I mean, people that support Trump, or people that have been taken in by his lies and Fox News lies, but don't believe it. But it's not new. The evidence has been around for years, and all people have to do is, if they want details of that evidence, is to read the Mueller report, and also Facebook, who were very clear about the vast numbers of Russian accounts based in Russia, essentially in the Russian troll farm, who pretended, which were fake accounts pretending to be Americans. One of them even organized a Miners for Trump event in America in 2016 before the election, pretended to be a miner in the Rust Belt supporting Trump, organizing Miners for Trump events and actual real live events that people went to. And the person was a Russian troll. Just extraordinary. The second thing to share is that some of us kind of hoped that immediately after leaving office, he'd be arrested pretty quickly and charged with a whole range of crimes. That was probably never going to happen, that it was immediate. But certainly those investigations are continuing, and could involve some pretty serious charges, which could potentially land Trump in prison for the rest of his life. In particular, the Southern District of New York District Attorney Cyrus Vance has been investigating Trump for a long time now, but since Trump left office, A judge ruled that his, long hidden tax returns, or at least some of his tax returns that Trump, Trump didn't allow to be released for so long when he was president. A judge ruled that they could be released to these authorities. So Cyrus Vance has access now to those Trump tax records. There's also an investigation, sort of separately but alongside, into the Trump family's profiting from the inauguration ceremony, from his inauguration ceremony in 2017. In particular, unbelievably extravagant charges, off the wall charges for using the Trump Hotel. And that's not just Trump, it's various members of his family too, his children. So there's a separate investigation into that. The New York Attorney General's office is investigating the Trump Organization, and the finance officer Alan Weisselberg, who kind of is one person who pretty much knows everything about Trump's dealings over the years. And it's likely that he'll face significant charges, and he's cooperating, with the authorities in that investigation, and therefore is likely to be providing some evidence which could lead in turn to charges against Trump. None of this is really new, because Michael Cohen, Trump's longtime lawyer, who again is one of those people that knows everything, has testified to Congress about Trump's illegal actions, in particular in relation to tax and the valuation of his properties, and how that has defrauded the IRS in America. So none of this is really new, but it's kind of, for me, it's actually comforting to know that those investigations are ongoing and may well lead to significant charges against Trump at some point. One can only hope. The next thing just to share is it's amusing in one way, but not in another, in that one of Trump's closest and most vocal supporters, Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, one of Trump's closest allies and friends, has been accused, and with significant evidence, has been accused of paying women for sex, including being accused of doing that with an underage girl, a 17-year-old girl, which is underage in America. And the payments, extraordinarily, the payments were made by his friend, who's now facing charges over this and is also cooperating with the authorities. And they were made to the women via a traceable payment system. So there are records of these transactions, which is extraordinary. He also apparently bragged about his sexual exploits with his colleagues on the Senate floor, bragged to them and showed them pictures of women that he'd slept with and so forth. They're just extraordinary. One of the most ridiculous things about it is that, facing an investigation into all of this, he stood up in front of a group of his supporters and said the Trump line, "They're not coming after me, they're coming after you," which is an American right-wing politician's way of trying to drum up support when they're in trouble for doing something illegal. They say, "They're not coming after me, it's the deep state and they're coming after you," and it's nonsense. I mean, the response is, no, they're coming after you, Matt Gaetz. They're coming after you because you paid women for sex, including, obviously having sex with an underage girl, which obviously should always be described as rape and sexual assault. So the fourth thing is that we now have this extraordinary situation with the GOP, with the Republican Party, that they have now sort of shifted to be even more the party that supports Trump and the big lie being that the election was stolen from him. The election was rigged. The Democrats rigged the election, and however they did it, whether it was voting machines or whatever, rigged the ballot. And unless, if you're in the Republican Party, whether you're a senator or a congressperson, if you don't promote the big lie, if you don't support Trump and say that the election was stolen from him fraudulently, you're out. you're ostracized. You're going to be primaried, meaning Trump and his supporters will put up a Trump supporting candidate against you the next time you're up for re-election. And they all know that, and they're all scared. And very few of them, only a tiny number of them, have the guts to speak the truth. They all know what the truth is. They all know the election wasn't stolen, that it's nonsense. I mean, possibly a couple of them believe the nonsense. You know, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, you know, the complete QAnon believing nutcases that there are. But the vast majority of them, you know, they know that it's utter nonsense, but they know that if they don't support it, then they could be ousted. So we have this extraordinary situation that the Republican Party are now just doubling down on this extraordinary big lie and their support of Trump, which is absolutely extraordinary. And they're also supporting this recount or vote count in Arizona. You know, the Republican-controlled legislature did recount after recount at the time, and said there was no evidence. I mean, all around the country, judges have said there was, you know, including many Republican judges, many of whom were appointed by Trump, have said there's no evidence of any kind of widespread fraud, anything that would alter the result. The fraud that's been found to be legit, you know, legitimate cases of fraud, absolutely minuscule numbers, and mostly Republicans trying to vote twice or using their mum's name or whatever. So just extraordinary. But there's going to be a big thing because this organization, private company, have been running an Arizona recount, doing all sorts of extraordinary things, bizarre things to recount the vote in Arizona, using all sorts of bizarre technology, checking if there's bamboo, fibers of bamboo to provide evidence that some of the ballots were shipped in from South Asia. and they think they can prove that possibly by finding shreds of bamboo, because of course, you know, everything from South Asia is covered in little fibers of bamboo. You know, it's just bizarre, but also very dangerous. I mean, the company that's running this vote recount, it's called Cyber Ninja. The owner and the CEO of Cyber Ninja are, you know, Trump cultists who promoted the big lie. And of course, they're going to announce their results, which is magically they will have found some massive kind of vote fraud that no one else, including Republicans whose job it is to look for it, couldn't find. So the whole thing's just extraordinary. And they've even ousted Liz Cheney, you know, one of the top Republicans and a real traditional right-wing Republican, because she refused to go along with the big lie, and she's been ousted from her congressional leadership role. So essentially the GOP, the Republican Party in America, have gone completely crazy. And I hope that it means that they will be completely and utterly unelectable for the foreseeable future, but who knows? A couple of other things is that they've been deliberately subverting the reality of the violent insurrection on the 6th of January, pretending it didn't happen. Early on, they were saying it was Antifa. Now they were saying it was all undercover FBI operatives rather than Trump supporters. Representative Andrew Clyde, Republican congressman, described the events of the day as he said something like, if you didn't know you were talking about the 6th of January, you would think it was a normal tourist visit. He said, the events of the day. You would think it was a normal tourist visit, he said. I mean, we're beyond this post-truth world. You know, we're into we're into a sort of massively down the rabbit hole. Truth doesn't matter anymore. I'll just say anything kind of world. It's just bizarre.
Can I just ask, did normal tourist
visits?
Did normal tourist visits usually involve killing police officers?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's clearly the number one question that needs to be asked of Andrew Clyde. And of course, police officers that were unbelievably brave and heroic on the day and saved the lives, probably, of a number of probably lots of senators, potentially Mike Pence, the vice president, potentially other Republicans, let alone Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, saved their lives with their heroic actions. Some of them gave their lives in fighting off this violent mob of Trump supporters. The GOP have been ignoring them, refusing to honour them, refusing to shake their hand and speak to them. Absolutely despicable. And this from the party that say Blue Lives Matter. What a joke. Next thing we've mentioned before, so just to say briefly that one thing that's extraordinarily dangerous is all over the country, Republican legislators have passed voter suppression laws to make sure that poor people, and particularly people of colour, are unable to, or far less likely to vote in future. It's so dangerous, so anti-democratic, and staggering that they can do that. But of course, each state in America is responsible for essentially running their own state election process and passing their own local laws. So the federal government can't sort of, there isn't one national blueprint for how elections need to be run and the laws under which they're run. Each state passes their own laws. And they pass these utterly despicable laws deliberately aimed at poor people and people of colour to prevent them voting, which is truly despicable. Could mean, you know, tens of millions of people are prevented from voting. The next thing
it's interesting,
yes.
Tom, that we talk about the President of the United States being the most powerful person on earth, and yet domestically their powers are so limited. So I think what we're usually talking about is their influence on the world stage, because as I said, domestically within the United States, there's so many things they just can't affect.
Yeah, no, it's there's always been, you know, this argument between federal powers and state powers, and you know, the president and the governors of states being at loggerheads with each other, particularly obviously when they're from different political parties. And yeah, there are so many things about the American democratic system which are great and truly democratic, and there are things which are appalling and completely anti-democratic. It's an extraordinary system, and you know, fascinating for people to study, actually, if anyone's into politics and democracy. The last thing I wanted to mention is extraordinary big news, and that's that just about a week ago, details emerged that during Trump's presidency, clearly with the authority of Trump himself and Bill Barr, his I have to say, truly corrupt Attorney General, the Department of Justice was spying on Trump's opponents, and that includes journalists, senators, Democrat senators like Adam Schiff, and their families, including children, spying on them, getting records from Apple, forcing Apple to turn over records and forcing them to do that in secret. You know, they weren't allowed to make that public. Just extraordinary and unprecedented. I mean, I'm sure that lots of, you know, some people might say, well, I bet that happens all the time under every presidency. And yeah, it probably does. But this is the first time that something as widespread and direct, sort of directly against the president's opponents, being targeting journalists, journalists that were sort of critical of the Trump administration, Democratic senators and their families were being spied on. It looks like it was hundreds of people in a very consistent way by Bill Barr's Department of Justice. Really staggering. And the amusing thing about it, of course, is that Trump always liked to rail about the deep state. He liked to pretend that the deep state was spying on him, and that you know, the deep state was working against him. And there he was in control of the deep state, getting them to do exactly what he complained about. Just staggering, and there will be massive repercussions from this. People have described it as, you know, something that's as big a scandal, or a bigger scandal than Watergate. So there will be big repercussions from this for sure, and I'm sure it'll end up with you know, people indicted and going to prison. So there's a little rundown really of how crazy Trump and the American right continue to be.
Do you think? Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. An amazing detail and an update. I think I'm probably a little bit more cynical than you about whether the American state will respond appropriately and whether they'll just identify a number of fall guys or fall people down the chain to make an example of, but ultimately they'll leave the big bird or the big birds relatively unscathed. That tends to be the way in which many Western societies, especially the United States and the UK, operate. They dump the patsies. They dump the patsies in the muck, but they walk away relatively clean.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's probably an unwritten rule amongst the elite and powerful that they don't push to get each other put in prison for corruption, because they're all corrupt. I mean, there's an argument that you can't get to the top of American politics, maybe UK politics, without being involved in corruption, without taking money from nefarious sources, be they from a foreign country, from Russian oligarchs, or be they from fossil fuel companies or dodgy criminals or whatever. You can't get to the top without being in some way corrupt, certainly in America, I'd argue, and or at least being involved in corruption. And so I think there's probably a bit of an unwritten rule that they don't go after each other, because they could all end up in prison. And fascinatingly, we heard yesterday Dominic Cummings released the WhatsApp messages, some WhatsApp messages between him and Boris Johnson, assuming that they're legitimate. I'm sure they are. And of course, we learned that Boris Johnson talked in March last year, talked about Matt Hancock, our health secretary, being effing hopeless. He said, he's effing hopeless. The message said from Boris Johnson to Cummings, and discussed replacing him. This is before 150,000 deaths. So yeah, should he have got rid of him then? Yeah, I mean, clearly yes, and then this effing hopeless person wouldn't have been in charge of dealing with our pandemic response, leading to 150,000 deaths. But why? Can I just make this last point? Why didn't Boris Johnson? If Boris Johnson thought he was effing hopeless and was considering replacing him, and knew that he was lying, because Cummings said he made it very clear to Johnson that Hancock was lying all the time about things. Why didn't Johnson get rid of him? Why didn't Johnson get rid of Priti Patel for bullying? Why hasn't Johnson got rid of Michael Gove for being found in court for lying? Why hasn't he sacked anyone for any of these things? My bet is that they know how corrupt Johnson is. So they don't. So we're now at this. I think Johnson is sort of the opposite of Trump, in that he won't sack anyone because he's scared that they'll reveal how corrupt and useless he is. Trump sacks everyone and then says, and if they tell the truth about him, he says, oh, they're just bitter. Whereas Johnson just, I think, is scared that they'll reveal his own corruption.
I think it's a distinct possibility, Tom, although the Tory party don't generally tend to work like that, because, like you said, there is so much cancer within that party that to expose it would take decades. I think it's more that there's two theories I have. One is that the particular individuals that you've mentioned and others are people that have been put there by other people that we are not aware of, or we can only surmise. The big corporate billionaires who run the media, we know that they have specific people in the Conservative Party who are their favourites. So it makes it very difficult for someone like Boris Johnson, who, let's be honest about this, he's not an assertive person in any respects like Churchill or Thatcher. He's, you know, some of the kindest words that you can say about Boris Johnson, he's a wet fart, because he's a weather vane. He goes with the direction. He's obsessed with the polls. He's obsessed with what people think of him. He's become a Bovril prime minister in that he's hated by the majority, but he's liked enough by a significant minority to stay in power. And also, I do believe as well that when he went round with his, the cabinet office, and he talked about possible people to replace Matthew Hancock, that nobody wanted it. Why would you want that poisoned chalice at that particular time, which could destroy your political career? Why not just leave Matthew Hancock in situ? And then at some point down the line, he becomes the scapegoat. You replace him quite straightforwardly with somebody else. Within 48 hours, everybody's forgotten that Matthew Hancock exists, and you rumble on being a prime minister until you decide to go, as is revealed by Dominic Cummings, to go off and have a good time and make lots of money.
Yeah. And that's what Cummings said, that the kind of the deal was with Hancock and Johnson, which is that he'll leave him in place and let him take the blame when the time comes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was excellent. Okay. I think, and obviously keep us updated as time goes by as to the travails of the American system, because people might, the readers might look at us and say, oh, why don't you spend so much time talking about America? Well, when the reason we spend a lot of time talking about the US is primarily because it perceives itself as now the ultimate superpower. And if you're a great big white shark traveling through the oceans, as the USA is perceived to be, we are just one of those pilot fish. So we are influenced and affected dramatically by what they do. So we do have to keep an eye on what's going across the pond, and we do have to analyze it and evaluate it, because it helps us to make sense also of our reality and the direction that we're going. So thank you, Tom.